In 1978, the lifeless body of a legendary star was discovered in a London flat belonging to singer-songwriter Harry Nilsson. Incredibly, just 4 years earlier, another of Nilsson's superstar friends had died in the very same bedroom of Nilsson's home. This might be a macabre footnote in rock history, but it utterly horrified Nilsson, who sold the property in despair after losing 2 friends within its walls. The scene would haunt him for the rest of his life, which itself was tragically cut short. Nilsson was an artist of immense talent and self-destructive tendencies, once celebrated as the most underrated singer-songwriter of the post-war era. And the truth behind those strange deaths, his wild friendship with John Lennon, and his refusal to ever play live music needs to be told. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Harry Edward Nilsson III was born June 15, 1941, in the Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, New York. He came into the world dirt poor and would later mine those struggles for artistic inspiration. Nilsson's father, Harry Nilsson Jr., abandoned the family when Harry was a toddler. This was a formative wound, the singer later chronicled in his song 1941, ruefully singing, well, in 1941, a happy father had a son. And by 1944, the father walked right out the door. In fact, young Harry grew up believing his father had died in World War II, only learning much later that the man had simply left and started a new life in California. The betrayal and poverty of Nilsson's early years left a painful mark. After his father's departure, Harry's mother, Betta Nilsson, struggled to make ends meet. Harry was shuttled between relatives on both coasts, sometimes living with grandparents or an uncle, and at one point even a stepfather, as the family pinballed between New York and California. Stability was hard to come by. One constant, however, was music. Nilsson's maternal grandparents were music lovers who gave the boy his first exposure to song. By his teens, Harry had a surprisingly rich voice and an almost savant-like musical ear, talents encouraged by a supportive stepfather who noticed the boy's gift and coached him in singing. Still, money was scarce, and adolescent Harry felt the financial strain he placed on his family. At just 15, he dropped out of high school, left home and rode a Greyhound bus to Los Angeles on his own. In LA, Nilsson hustled to survive. He took odd jobs, slept in cheap apartments, and by the late 1950s, found steady work as a theatre usher and then a bank computer operator. Nilsson later joked that he had a split personality like Superman, bank clerk by day, rock and roll hopeful by night. In truth, he was actually honing his craft very nicely in LA. While working as an assistant manager at the Paramount Theatre, he learned piano techniques from musicians who performed on stage and snuck in practice time on the big hall's piano. When the Paramount closed in 1960, Nilsson turned full attention to songwriting and recording demo tapes, all while holding down the graveyard shift at the bank to pay rent. Before I go on, I'd like to remind you all that it's less than 1 week until the very first episode of Rock and Roll Histories is launched on Patreon and for YouTube members. Every week, I'll be putting out a 10 to 15 minute long bonus audio episode looking at some obscure facet of rock history. There's stuff like the mad events surrounding the Monterey Pop Festival during the Summer of Love, the history of CBGB and Neil Young's darkest hour. If you want to have that extra weekly dose delivered directly, all you have to do is click the join button below this video or follow the link to the Patreon page and sign up to the Club Singer tier for $5 a month. It's the most incredible and fantastic way to help me out as well. I hope you'll enjoy the little episodes I'm giving back in return for the support. Thanks so much to all of you who have signed up so far. If you're undecided, Patreon even offers a 7-day free trial with no strings attached so you can listen to the episodes and see if you like them. First one will be out on Thursday, the 7th of August. Hope to see you over there. Now let's get back to Harry Nilsson. Nilsson's break came from his sheer persistence in Los Angeles' music circles. By 1963, in his early 20s, he had impressed songwriter and publisher Scott Turner enough to be hired to sing demo records for $5 a song. Soon he was collaborating with pop maestros like Phil Spector and songwriter John Mariscalco, even providing harmonies for Little Richard. During one session, the flamboyant rock pioneer was startled to hear Nilsson's vocal style and reputedly exclaimed, "My, you sing good for a white boy." Nilsson's voice, warm, elastic, and steeped in the gospel and pop of his youth, was turning some pretty large heads. He began placing his original songs with established artists. The Monkees recorded his playful tune, Cuddly Toy, in 1967, and the Yardbirds cut his nursery rhyme rocker, 10 Little Indians. Hits by the Turtles, Glenn Campbell, and Three Dog Night would soon follow, all drawn from Nilsson's songbook. Each success gave him further entree into the industry. One important moment arrived courtesy of the Monkees. When Monkees vocalist Davy Jones decided to record Cuddly Toy, the session was attended by music publisher Lester Sill, who promptly marched Nilsson out to the parking lot and told him, "You can quit the bank." The songwriter's moonlight hours of punching keys and sorting checks were over. He had earned enough credibility and publishing advance money to pursue music full-time. That same year, Nilsson landed a recording contract with RCA Victor, the storied label of Elvis Presley. His debut album, Pandemonium Shadow Show, 1967, was an eclectic showcase for his songwriting and 4-octave vocal range. Though it sold rather modestly, the album was a critical darling and hinted at Nilsson's irreverent humour and studio experimentation. One track in particular would change his life. You Can't Do That, a tongue-in-cheek Beatles medley in which Nilsson stitched together lyrics and riffs from 24 Fab Four songs into a single tribute. The audacious cover caught the ear of Derek Taylor, the Beatles press officer, who was so keen on it that he sent copies of Pandemonium Shadow Show to each of the Beatles in London. Unbeknownst to Nilsson, he had gained 4 very famous fans. In early 1968, Harry Nilsson was still a virtually unknown songwriter in the US, but that only lasted until the Beatles' unexpected endorsement rocketed him into the spotlight. In February that year, the Beatles convened a press conference in New York to announce the formation of Apple Corps. When a reporter asked John Lennon to name his favourite American artist, Lennon casually replied, "Nilsson." The reporter then earnestly turned to Paul McCartney to ask him what his favourite American group was. "Nilsson's my favourite group," McCartney deadpanned. The quip made headlines. Suddenly, the music world was clamouring to learn about this mysterious group that Lennon and McCartney adored, only to discover it was one man, an outsider singer-songwriter from Brooklyn. A few days later, Nilsson's phone rang at 5 a.m. It was John Lennon calling from London, ranting that he'd been listening to Nilsson's album on repeat for 36 hours. Later that morning, our more time zone considerate Paul McCartney rang as well to offer his own praise. Harry Nilsson, the one-time bank clerk who had never performed a major concert, suddenly found the Beatles as his personal advocates and friends. The impact on Nilsson's career was instantaneous. Music executives who previously hadn't returned his calls were crawling around him, begging to sign him for projects. Reporters showed up eager to profile the new so-called American Beatle. Nilsson, shy by nature and intensely private, proved an elusive interview subject who often deflected questions with his zany humour. Nonetheless, his star was rising. In mid-1968, RCA released Aerial Ballet, Nilsson's second album, and the record was named after his Swedish immigrant grandparents' acrobat act. It included an innocuous little cover song Nilsson had picked up from folk singer Fred Neil, Everybody's Talkin'. Fatefully, director John Schlesinger chose Nilsson's wistful version of Everybody's Talkin' to soundtrack his 1969 film, Midnight Cowboy. The song's plaintive, "I can't see me loving nobody but you," delivered in Nilsson's clear, bittersweet tenor, struck a chord with audiences. It raced up to number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100, giving Nilsson his first hit single and a Grammy Award, Best Male Pop Vocal, in 1970. Ironically, the breakthrough hit that made genius songwriter Harry Nilsson a household name was one he hadn't written himself. As a matter of fact, he had submitted his own song for the film, the elegiac "I Guess the Lord Must Be in New York City," But the producers were so attached to Nilsson's cover of Everybody's Talking that they stuck with it, so much so they rejected even a Bob Dylan song in the process. Nilsson joked that his consolation prize for being passed over as a writer was pretty good, an Oscar-winning film featuring his voice and a Grammy in hand. By 1969, Nilsson was on a creative roll. He scored a second Grammy nomination for The Courtship of Eddie's Father, a TV sitcom theme he composed and sang in a lilting, fatherly tone. He was also writing songs that other artists turned into gold. Three Dog Night took Nilsson's catchy lament "One is the Loneliest Number," which Harry wrote in solitude after hearing a busy signal on the telephone, and made it a top 5 hit in 1969. Nilsson's original version of One had been released as a single but failed to chart. The cascade of successes affirmed Nilsson's reputation as a songwriter's songwriter. The Monkees, the Turtles, Blood, Sweat and Tears, Glenn Campbell, and even an incredulous Little Richard all performed Nilsson-penned tunes by the end of the decade. Critic Matthew Gidley later marvelled that Nilsson's knowledge of pop's forms was encyclopedic. It could write you a cuddly McCartney melody or a Bacharach David Stringfest with equal ease. Amid this flurry of activity, Nilsson finally met the Beatles in person. In autumn 1968, they invited him to London during the White Album sessions. He hung out at Abbey Road Studios, and he formed strong friendships with John Lennon and Ringo Starr that would last the rest of their lives. Back in LA, Nilsson carried that Beatles blessing into the new decade. In 1971, he delivered his magnum opus, the album Nilsson Schmilsson, recorded in London with producer Richard Perry. It yielded Nilsson's signature song and greatest commercial triumph, Without You. This was a heart-wrenching ballad originally written by Pete Ham and Tom Evans and recorded by their band Badfinger, who were a Beatles protege band. But Without You was transformed by Nilsson into a tour de force. His voice starts soft and melancholy, then climbs to a climatic wail of desperation. Released in late 1971, Without You became a #1 hit on both sides of the Atlantic and earned Nilsson a Grammy for Best Male Pop Vocal Performance in 1973. Critics and fans were astonished at the emotional power of Nilsson's vocals. The track virtually invented the pop power ballad years before the term existed. Even Frank Sinatra was said to be an admirer of Nilsson's crooning on that song. And if you always thought Without You was one of the most romantic tunes ever written, the story of what happened while the vocal track was being laid down might just ruin that perception. Harry claimed that the force he had to generate to hit the highest note in the song caused him to burst a large hemorrhoid in the process. Lovely. Nilsson Schmilsson showcased the full range of Harry's musical personality. Alongside the lush drama of Without You, he tossed off the playful calypso novelty Coconut, a top 10 hit in 1972, and the hard rock rave-up Jump Into the Fire, in which Nilsson howls at the top of his lungs over a churning riff. The album went gold and got a Grammy Album of the Year nomination, confirming that Nilsson had successfully bridged the gap from cult songwriter to mainstream star. The man who had once been known only as the Beatles' favourite underdog was now racking up hits of his own. However, it still needled him that he never scored a comparably huge hit with a self-written song under his own name, a fact that he said bothered him for the rest of his days. Still, his pen was hardly idle. Album cuts like the whimsical The Puppy Song, written at Paul McCartney's request for Mary Hopkin, and the poignant Remember, Christmas, cemented Nilsson's reputation as a first-class songwriter among his peers. Nilsson's artistry was being recognised across the industry. Ringo Starr declared that Harry had the greatest voice on planet Earth and enlisted Nilsson as a drinking buddy and collaborator. Ringo would even serve as best man at Nilsson's third wedding years later. He also decided to keep the wagon rolling by releasing Son of Schmilsson, while Nilsson Schmilsson was still in the charts. The follow-up underperformed, partly because Harry was growing overconfident and began to ignore producer Richard Perry's sage advice on refining his songs, which had become bawdy self-parodies in some cases. The singles were underwhelming, but the album still managed a number 12 spot on the charts. By the early 1970s, Harry Nilsson had reached a pinnacle of success entirely on his own terms, which is to say, without ever performing a major public concert. He was one of the few pop stars of his era who shunned touring completely. Possessed of crippling stage fright and scarred by a disastrous performance during his youth, Nilsson simply refused to go on tour despite label pressure. He could be that guy who didn't perform live, Nilsson's son Kefo later reflected, noting that once his father proved he could succeed solely as a recording artist, he made non-performing a kind of signature mystique. Instead, Nilsson focused on the studio, where he was most comfortable. He indulged ambitious projects like Nilsson Sings Newman, a 1970 album of Randy Newman's songs, on which Harry overdubbed 150 vocal tracks by himself to harmonise like a one-man choir. He also wrote and narrated a whimsical children's fable, The Point, which spawned the charming hit Me and My Arrow. There seemed to be no musical territory Nilsson feared to explore, except perhaps the concert stage. Richard Perry was another who tried to encourage Harry to perform. He said he did do the in-concert series on BBC television with Stanley Dorfman, which was very popular at the time. His show was very interesting and innovative with a lot of new technology, multiple images and things like that. But I think any artist, with very few exceptions and none that I can really think of, can immeasurably enhance his career by appearing in front of the public. At some point, the public needs to reach out and touch the artist, experience and feel them in person. Success, however, brought new temptations. As the 1970s progressed, Nilsson became as famous for his wild offstage exploits as for his music. The same gentle soul who wrote tender ballads was also a notorious party animal, running with rock's most debauched clique, the Hollywood Vampires, a hard-drinking social club of 1970s celebrities. On any given weekend, Harry could be found carousing in Los Angeles or London with pals like John Lennon, Ringo Starr, Keith Moon, Mickey Dolenz of the Monkees, and Alice Cooper. And indeed, the legends are outrageous. In March 1974, during Lennon's infamous 18-month lost weekend separation from Yoko Ono, Lennon and Nilsson teamed up in Los Angeles to form a sort of drunken duo, egging each other on to ever greater mischief. One night at the Troubadour Club, they infamously heckled the Smothers Brothers comedy act until the two were thrown out. Nilsson, who had a wicked sense of humour even when blotto, felt guilty the next day. The Smothers Brothers were old friends of his. This was also the moment a waitress put the mighty Lennon right back in his place with one of the greatest put-downs in rock history. Lennon had found some tampons in the ladies' room, which, for some reason, he had visited, and he and Harry decided to stick the tampons to their heads. Cue Lennon walking around the place bothering people in this strange get-up until a waitress asked him to take the tampon off. Lennon then snarled the immortal line that always exposes a pompous buffoon. "Do you know who I am?" To this, the waitress responded, "Yeah, an asshole with a tampon on his head." Nicely done. During this chaotic period, Lennon decided to produce Nilsson's next album, and he was intrigued by the chance to work with his talented friend. The 1974 project, fittingly titled Pussycats, became a rock and roll free-for-all in the studio and nearly cost Harry Nilsson his voice. Fueled by nightly revelry and friendly one-upmanship, Nilsson pushed his vocal cords to the breaking point, trying to impress Lennon with his screaming rock vocals. Partway through the sessions, he ruptured a vocal cord, causing hemorrhaging in his throat. Incredibly, Nilsson told no one, not even Lennon, for fear that John might abandon the project if he knew Harry was injured. Instead, Nilsson downed brandy and cocaine to numb the pain and croaked his way through the remaining recordings with a bleeding throat. His once angelic voice was now a husky rasp, straining to hit notes it used to sail through. Long-time fans were shocked when Pussycats was released. The singer, renowned for purity of tone, now sounded like he'd been gargling glass. Nilsson hoped it was temporary, but in truth his glorious range never fully recovered. The damage was permanent. Despite the vocal setback, Nilsson carried on recording. Pussycats, featuring contributions from Lennon and an all-star cast, including Keith Moon and Ringo, managed to crack the top 100, and Nilsson landed a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract extension with RCA, thanks in part to his feisty pal Lennon. During one booze-fueled escapade, Lennon and Nilsson staggered into RCA's offices unannounced and demanded a meeting with the label president about Nilsson's expiring contract. Lennon slyly insinuated that he himself might sign with RCA if they treated Nilsson right. It worked. RCA promptly offered Nilsson a rich new deal on the spot. As Lennon reportedly told the executives, Nilsson was one of only 2 real artists the label had ever had: Elvis Presley and Harry Nilsson, and that's it. The cheeky name-dropping paid off, but despite the fresh contract and a recovering voice, Harry's commercial momentum was waning. Tastes in the mid-70s were shifting toward disco and arena rock, leaving Nilsson's quirky pop slightly out of step. His albums Do It on Monday and Sandman saw diminishing sales, though they contained gems of sophisticated songwriting. Nilsson himself was drifting into domestic life and, unfortunately, deeper into substance abuse. Tragedy struck Nilsson's life in 1974 in a way that had nothing to do with record sales. That July, Cass Elliot, the powerhouse singer of the Mamas and the Papas and a close friend of Nilsson, died unexpectedly in Harry's London apartment. Nilsson had lent Cass his flat at 9 Curzon Place, Mayfair, while he was away in Los Angeles. The shocking death of the 32-year-old singer from heart failure, not choking on a sandwich, as some rather cruel false rumours claimed, devastated Nilsson. He felt a lingering unease about the apartment, but held on to it. Then, 4 years later, in 1978, this unspeakable misfortune repeated itself. Keith Moon, the Who's hell-raising drummer and one of Harry's dearest companions, also died in Nilsson's London flat, in the very same room where Cass had passed. Moon overdosed on prescription pills after a night out, and you can hear all about that in detail. In the episode I did on Keith a few weeks back, I'll stick a link on screen, and in the description if you want to have a look after this one. Nilsson was shattered by the loss of yet another friend under his roof. He could not bear the thought of the cursed apartment after that. Within weeks, Nilsson sold the property to Pete Townsend of The Who, having no desire ever to set foot in it again. These twin tragedies weighed heavily on Nilsson, amplifying the creeping darkness in his personal life. As the decade neared its end, the happy-go-lucky troubadour who once sang, "Put the lime in the coconut, you drink 'em both up," seemed beset by ghosts, booze and regrets. There were, however, also positive changes in Nilsson's mid-70s life. In 1975, he met a lovely Irish-born shipping heiress named Una O'Keeffe and fell deeply in love. After 2 divorces, his first marriage to Sandra McTaggart had lasted only 2 years in the mid-1960s. His second, to Diane Clatworthy, fell apart. Amid the chaos of his drinking by 1974, Nilsson was ready for real stability. He married Una in August 1976, with best pal Ringo Starr serving as best man at the wedding. Over the years that followed, the couple would have 6 children together, an ever-growing army of little Nilssons. At heart, the rambunctious Harry adored being a family man. In home videos, he was often seen strumming a guitar and crooning lullabies to his kids, a glass of whiskey nearby. Fatherhood seemed to mellow him somewhat, but he could never fully shake his addictions. By 1977, Harry Nilsson's recording career was faltering. The punk and disco revolutions made his sophisticated pop seem old-fashioned, and RCA Records grew increasingly indifferent to their one-time golden boy. That year, Nilsson released the practically unpronounceable Nilsson, an elegant album of orchestrated pop that he considered some of his best work. His voice, partially healed, sounded strong again, but the label scarcely promoted it. When it predictably flopped, Nilsson felt disillusioned and negotiated a release from his RCA contract. His final album of new material for many years, 1980's Flash Harry, was issued only in Europe with little fanfare. At just 39 years old, Nilsson walked away from the merry-go-round of the music industry. He unofficially retired from recording, contenting himself with guest appearances and soundtrack contributions. One of his more notable soundtracks was for Robert Altman's 1980 film Popeye, including the peculiar yet oddly charming He Needs Me and He's Large, sung by Shelley Duvall's Olive Oil in the cult film. What precipitated this retreat? The murder of John Lennon in December 1980 was, of course, a major turning point for Harry. Lennon's senseless shooting in New York horrified Nilsson to his core. John had been a brother-in-arms, a creative partner, and a drinking mate during Harry's prime years. Now he was gone to violence. Nilsson reacted by transforming his grief into activism. He became a passionate advocate for gun control, lending his name and time to the coalition to stop handgun violence and other causes. For much of the 1980s, Harry Nilsson essentially stepped away from music to focus on campaigning against gun violence and raising his young children in the relative quiet of Los Angeles' suburbs. He still indulged in the occasional wild night, old habits die hard, but friends noted that Harry seemed gentler, more content puttering around the house in slippers. He had traded the spotlight for domestic peace. Still, the call of music never left him completely. In the mid-1980s, Nilsson began cautiously plotting a comeback. He had sobered up, to a degree, and written some new songs. Now and then, he even made impromptu performances at fan conventions, something unimaginable in his younger years. Beatles Fan Fest organizer Mark Lapidos recalls inviting Nilsson on stage at a convention jam session. At first, he told me, no, I'm the rock star who doesn't play live. But within a year, Harry had begun regularly joining the Beatles cover band for performances. He'd saunter on stage holding a glass of scotch and a cigarette and run through a variety of Beatles covers. The one-time recluse discovered he actually enjoyed these low-pressure gigs. By the early 1990s, Harry was seriously mulling a concert tour, something he had never done. He even talked about performing his old hits with a full band, just to prove he could. Yet there were pragmatic reasons behind Nilsson's comeback itch as well. Decades of royalty mismanagement, bad investments, and financial misfortune had left him in a precarious spot by the 90s. In one incident, a former business manager embezzled a vast sum of Nilsson's savings, nearly wiping him out. Harry, who had made millions in the 70s, suddenly found himself worrying about paying the mortgage and supporting his big family. A tour and a new album could refill his coffers. Nilsson also saw it as a chance to bolster his legacy, to remind the world of his genius on stage while he still had time. In 1992, Nilsson took a step toward that comeback dream. He reached out to his old friend Ringo Starr, who was then drumming with his all-star band, and arranged to make a surprise appearance at a concert in Las Vegas. On September 4th, 1992, Harry Nilsson walked on stage at the Caesars Palace showroom unannounced, wearing an ill-fitting linen suit and a nervous smile, and for the first time ever, sang Without You live in concert. Those in the audience could scarcely believe they were seeing Nilsson himself. Backed by Ringo's band, including Todd Rundgren helping cover the high harmonies, Nilsson delivered a performance that was ragged, poignant, and utterly real. His voice was roughened and deep from decades of hard living, and he struggled to hit some of the high notes that once soared effortlessly. By what he lacked in polish, he made up for in heart. As he reached the song's climax, he filled it with a weathered soulfulness. The casino audience didn't even recognize him at first, but once it clicked, they began cheering and singing along by the final chorus. His performance was quite believable, Rundgren observed. It didn't sound like he had never performed the song before. When the last note faded, Nilsson received a standing ovation. For one night in Vegas, he had stepped out from the shadows and proven to himself he really could do it. Harry Nilsson slayed the biggest demon in his life that night. He defeated stage fright once and for all. Tragically, it was to be Harry Nilsson's first and last real concert. Just a few months later, in early 1993, Nilsson suffered a massive heart attack. He survived it, but his health was irreparably damaged. Determined to secure his family's future, Harry spent his remaining energy racing to finish a final album. Against doctor's orders, he strained his weakened voice in the studio, recording vocal tracks for a batch of new songs with producer Mark Hudson. By the start of 1994, the album, tentatively titled Papa's Got a Brown New Robe, later released posthumously as Lost and Found, was nearly complete. Nilsson's spirits were reportedly high. He was writing again, excited about the music and looking forward to a comeback showcase that would show the world Harry Nilsson still had magic in him. Fate had other plans. On January 15, 1994, Harry Nilsson died quietly in his sleep from heart failure at his home in Agoura Hills, California. He was 52 years old. Nilsson left behind 7 children, the oldest, Zach, from his second marriage, and 6 little ones with Una, and a bereft widow. In a final gesture, befitting his devotion, Harry had updated his will just days before his death, ensuring his family would be cared for. In Los Angeles, a star-studded memorial service saw friends like Ringo Starr, George Harrison, Jeff Lynne, and Van Dyke Parks pay tearful tribute, sharing stories of Nilsson's humor, generosity, and brilliance. One critic, Kevin Cole, recently wrote this poetic tribute to the man, and it caught my eye. Forget the snoozy bumble of Bing Crosby or the glitzy hype of Sinatra. Nilsson's voice was the most unique and versatile of his generation. He could scat like Cab Calloway, yodel like a Tyrolean milkmaid. His whistling put the birds to shame. Hyperbole, perhaps, but not by much. Nilsson's vocal feats on records like Without You and Walk Right Back remain astonishing, and his songs continue to find new audiences. In recent years, his jaunty 1971 tune, Gotta Get Up, became a recurring theme on Netflix's hit series Russian Doll, introducing Nilsson's music to a new generation in 2019. And of course, Coconut pops up in films and commercials whenever a breezy laugh is needed. The emotional gut punch of Without You has been covered by dozens of major artists, from Mariah Carey to Heart, each trying to match Nilsson's emotive fire. For the devoted Harry heads, as hardcore Nilsson fans sometimes call themselves, there is a deep satisfaction in seeing their hero finally recognized. In 2015, Rolling Stone ranked Harry Nilsson among the 100 greatest songwriters of all time, praising him as a pioneer of the Los Angeles studio sound and a crucial bridge between the Beatles and the 1970s singer-songwriters. And the very intimate, confessional quality of Nilsson's songwriting, the way his life story can be traced song by song, album by album, gives his catalogue a cohesive narrative power. As biographer Alan Shipton wrote, there are few artists whose life can be so graphically traced in their music. All his experiences find their way into one of the most fascinating collections of music of the latter half of the 20th century. In a sense, you almost don't need to listen to this video about Harry Nilsson. He told the whole story himself in his songs. And I wholeheartedly recommend you go and check out as much as you can beyond the few big hits we all know and love. There are plenty of gems, not least that Popeye soundtrack. I loved that when I was a kid. Maybe his own son Kifo summed up his old man best. What more could you want as an artist, Kifo said, than to know your songs still make people happy? Well, that's about all I've got for you this week. Thanks for listening. If you love rock and roll, I've got a feeling you might also love the range of shirts I've got for sale at the moment over at the Rock and Roll Mystery Store. They're all exclusive and designed by me. There's a variety of sizes and colours to choose from, so why not click the link and have a gander? I'm particularly proud of the Mark Bolan design. Anyway, do leave a like and even better, a comment to tell me about your favourite Harry Nilsson track. I've been Chester. I hope you enjoyed this one. See you next time. Cheers.